It was almost exactly 4 years ago when construction workers at the site of the James Reese Technical Center in Fort Bend ISD discovered bodies. Ultimately, 95 remains were found and were determined to be the bodies of convicts leased by the state to a plantation in Sugar Land. It was a way for the landowners to get cheap labor after slavery was abolished. This wasn't only happening in Texas, but in all of the southern states in this country, after slavery was no longer an option for cheap labor. Dr. Matthew Mancini literally wrote the book on the topic of convict leasing. His book, One Dies, Get Another, Convict Leasing in the American South. Dr. Mancini, good morning to you. I'm fascinated by this topic. What is it that drew you toward this area of study?
Well, thanks for having me. It's and that was a good intro to this program. Many years ago, 46 years ago, I started working as a young assistant professor in a history department, and my dean wanted to have college courses for prisoners in several prisons in the states, and so she made me the director of this program. And that really, I learned a lot about the history of prisons in Georgia and knew a little bit about convict leasing. So I started to then do the primary research. So that was a long time ago, and I published a little bit and then moved on to another subject. And so then I came back to convict leasing in the 90s.
So was convict leasing something that states coordinated to implement, or was it something that they just kind of saw another state doing and that it worked that way?
Well, I'm quite serious. That is a very good question. And it might at first seem like there was actual coordination. But in fact, each state stumbled and bumbled into the convict leasing in its own kind of stupid way. What makes it look like it might be coordinated is because it only happened in the South. Mm-hmm. No other part of the country, for any extended period of time, there's a few exceptions, leased convicts. But all of the states of the former Confederacy did lease convicts except for Virginia.
So the principle involved, for people who may not be aware of it, was that people who were arrested for various crimes were then part of the system, and that made them available to be leased out. Is that the simple way to explain that?
Yes, and again, Kimbrell, that's a very very helpful way to put it. And people, your viewers should know that the term convict leasing is actually a very good and accurate term. States had custody over people who had been convicted of crimes. Most of these would not be crimes today. But they had custody of these people, and then they literally advertised, they sent out notices that these men and women, mostly men, of course, were available to be leased to the state. So the state was a lessor, mm-hmm. and businessmen were the lessee, and they would put in bids and lease prisoners for forced labor.
One of the things,
the cost of these contracts, especially in the earlier days, were incredibly low, and the amount of wealth that was accumulated by lessees was enormous. Many people became millionaires on, I would say, on the basis of today's dollars, became millionaires by leasing convicts.
So was this, we assume that this was something that was basically impacting African Americans. Was this something that was just blacks, or was convict leasing colorblind?
Convict leasing, as I have said, people who lease convicts were perfectly happy to hyper-exploit white people. But convict leasing as a system was a part of the general system of racial subordination in the South. It's quite clear that it was a labor system for concentrating and controlling black labor and distributing it to businessmen in the South. That's a simple way, perhaps it's more complicated, but yes, it is a story of black history first and foremost.
So you'll be speaking at the February 19th Day of Remembrance for the Sugar Land 95, and progress has been made there. They're honoring the site there where those bodies were found. But what was the particular in that system that stands out? Does Sugar Land's prosperity basically during that time? Did it happen because of convict leasing, or can you kind of see that that's where it kind of led, or how do you analyze that?
Well, again, you're a good interviewer. These are great questions, and I'm not an expert about the economic history of Sugarland, but without question, this idea that Sugarland was built by Imperial Sugar and the like is misleading at best. And the wealth in this area was based on the backs of convicts. It was convict labor that built the area. And speaking about the Day of Remembrance that's coming up, the organization SOJUS down there in Sugarland is just doing a terrific job of bringing together academics, community activists, clergy, politicians, businessmen, and so forth in an attempt to have proper memorialization of those prisoners whose bodies were discovered 4 years ago.
This whole process, when you see what has happened across the country through the years, that it was all in the southern states, why do you think there was no outrage about this? Or was it just the time where, blacks were, in the South anyway, were subjected to lesser situations?
Yeah, curiously, you might say, it might seem curious. When you examine it more, it's not so curious. There was a lot of outrage about convict leasing all throughout its entire history. People were not that happy with it, but I think, as is the case today with prison reform, most people just don't care one way or the other. But there was quite a bit of opposition and resentment by people. But the people who leased convicts were extremely powerful, one, and two, there weren't any other. As far as the politicians were concerned, there weren't any other options. Most states didn't have prisons, or didn't have prisons that could accommodate the population for sure. So there's Huntsville here in Texas, and there's a Little Rock had a prison, but for the most part, there weren't any alternatives in place to convict leasing for several decades until about the First World War. And by the way, I would say, just clarify that we're talking about a period from about the early to mid 1870s until about the First World War in most states.
So we're going to talk more, because this is obviously a conversation that I'm interested in. I hope the viewers are as well. Thank you so much. We're going to continue on Newsmakers Extra, Matt, and look forward to doing that with you in just a minute.